Hey everyone, welcome to today's session. This is Prajakta here. I'm working as a head of AI at Unravel Data, and I'm currently driving the economics, optimization, and governance of autonomous AI systems on enterprise data platforms. So let me share my screen. We have a few slides today, and then we will jump right into the demo. So for today's session, we will be discussing how Unravel basically walks the journey from recommendation to action with some of our enterprise customers. And this is quite a challenge, especially if you are operating at scale and looking at recommendations that are span anything more than hundreds in numbers, right? So in today's session, we will be basically looking at why many of the enterprises like yours basically stall before they can actually take a recommendation and bring it to action. Then we'll discuss about what does it actually take for a recommendation to be qualified as an actionable recommendation. The next, we will talk about how Unravel basically earns your trust with autonomous execution with a three-phased approach. And then we will talk about how we scale this at an enterprise level by looking at the recommendation or an optimization life cycle completely governed by an agent end to end so that it fits into your day-to-day workflows. And then we will end with a live demo that takes you from an opportunity into the Databricks environment to the value getting realized by the end of the session. So many of the customers basically, this is something that you might also be facing in your day-to-day challenges. Whenever you see some recommendations, you try to diagnose some gaps, efficiency gaps or wastage in terms of the cost that you are trying to cover up in the Databricks estate across different categories of infrastructure, code, pipeline, storage, and so on. Uh, Although the recommendations might be technically sound and trustworthy, it is often the challenge around trying to apply them in the environment that becomes a little bit tricky. For example, some of our customers basically have all of their infrastructure configurations in a version control system. So getting past that is basically, it's not just applying the recommendation and changing your cluster or your warehouse size to the appropriate recommended one, but it is more about persisting and sustaining that change end to end, right? So seeing your change actually make its way through into the different environments is one of the biggest challenges. The second type of challenge that I typically call it as a silent failure or a silent wastage is basically, let's say you have a multi-cluster job or a pipeline or a query that is really expensive. And some of these failures that happen behind the scenes are silently ignored because they don't get surfaced in a timely way. And even if, let's say, we have some recommendations, these are intricate recommendations that spans cross entity or cross business units. The approval trains here are typically tricky, and it needs an end-to-end auditable mechanism to review that change, apply the change, and make sure that change actually lands into production the way it is supposed to be, right? The third type of challenge customers face across, let's say, many of the jobs are basically writing to orphaned storage and idle volumes is something that we observe in a lot of workloads and so on, right? So unless an agent basically goes ahead and continuously monitors the timeliness of these recommendations is something that gets lost. So even if the recommendations arrive, they should arrive at a time where the effectiveness of the recommendations should still stay through. And then the final challenge is one of my favorite ones here. Basically, imagine that you have a Databricks estate of 400 plus departments and 200 plus workspaces, and you are getting 500 plus recommendations every week coming out of Unravel or any other system, right? So now these recommendations is a hassle to handle end to end because the as we will see in a couple of slides, the recommendation does go through an end-to-end life cycle. So managing the entire life cycle for recommendations at that volume is not easy. So Unravel basically groups those recommendations, creates cases for them, and even automates it with a supervised and governed blast radius and a scope that is acceptable to you, and make sure that the autonomous auto apply basically works at scale along with your estate. Now, this section of the recommendation challenges is basically around how to get past the organizational friction. So many a times you have jobs or entities which doesn't have a clear owner defined. The owner is there, but they are not reachable. Somebody basically owned the job a couple of months ago, but they left the company, right? So ownership attribution is a real challenge whenever it comes to taking a recommendation and trying to have it implemented at an enterprise scale. Then the other story is around the rollbacks, right? So who is going to monitor all the drifts? Let's say we go ahead and apply a recommendation. Then what happens to that recommendation? What happens when there's a data variability or a change in the parameters? And how do we basically make sure that somebody is looking through at that entity which was acted upon end to end, not just as a one stop option, right? There are times when the context is not clear. The metadata doesn't give you the information on is there a SLA around a particular uh, entity that we are governing through Unravel platform, right? So in those cases, what are the exception rules? What are the basically reviewer gateways, and how do we get that context? How do we ensure that that context doesn't just live through for that single recommendation, but gets carried forward for the future recommendations that get generated on the same entity or the same business units and so on. And finally, the change management friction, right? So it's one thing to take a few recommendations, make those fixes, create a few PRs around them. But when it comes to actually handling this at a scale, making sure that, let's say, if we have pre-approved a set of recommendations, one of our customers actually did that, right, in the recent weeks. So when we pre-approve the recommendations, we want to make sure that the um, blast radius for those recommendations ensures that they are operating within the boundaries that were set and even the risk categories that were set for those recommendations. So this brings us to a question of when an optimization actually lands into your inbox or onto your dashboard, what makes it actionable? So first of all, I think Unravel's recommendations or insights go through a series of checks where we qualify them to be actionable in terms of an autonomous execution. So they go through a series of dependency checks, regression testing in terms of that, okay, what is the sequence of steps that will happen after this particular recommendation is applied, right? We make sure that the performance verification is there. Resizing a cluster doesn't impact the SLAs for the workloads, right? We give out the cost impact estimation beforehand so that when the user is basically going to prioritize a particular recommendation, it is not based on any guesswork, but more on the lines of, hey, this is the impact that this recommendation is going to have, so that they are prepared to validate it later on, right? Then the recommendations basically have to operate within safety guardrails, need to have gated approvals wherever necessary, especially in cases where you have to go through multiple layers of change management into your enterprise, right? And finally, it has to sit through into your existing workflows. It should not be a case that, hey, Unravel generated 500 recommendations. Now I have to create a different life cycle for it. I have to create a different workflow for it. No. So all of that goes out of the door. There's no parallel approval paths or executions and attribution chains needed. Unravel basically picks it up automatically, right? But before we get into the automatic execution zone, sorry, the autonomous execution zone, I think there is a part about gaining that trust. So how does Unravel earn that trust? So there is a three-phased approach to it. First is basically the manual approvals. We basically give out all these recommendations and suggest that you apply these in lower environments to begin with, right? And go through each of those recommendations and apply them. And we give a complete end-to-end auditable verification that what we recommended as potential savings and what you ended up realizing as savings is something that is matching to your satisfaction and based on the workload variability and all, right? Now, once that step is done, we basically move on to a scoped autonomy in which we decide that, okay, for XYZ kind of recommendations, we need gated approvals. For other kind of recommendations, we are good to go with an autonomous application, right? And then finally, in the continuous verification phase, basically, let's say all these recommendations are applied. Then our agents basically make sure that every single change happening to that entity from that point onwards is monitored post execution. And then we are also making sure that there are no regressions in terms of cost and performance. And if there are, and there are any guardrails set around the thresholds, then we revert those recommendations based on the defined um, conditions, right? So now that gets us finally into the entire life cycle of the recommendations and how that happens with the agentic framework. So Arbix is our autonomous agentic framework that we introduced earlier this year. And basically what Arbix does is for every phase of the recommendation, once it is generated, it basically continuously monitors that, pulls on the telemetry needed for generating those recommendations, creates all these signals, right? And make sure that each signal has an owner that is mapped to it. This is something that we again pick up autonomously on your environment for the ownership mapping and attribution. We make sure that the owners and the people who are responsible for those entities actionability are notified about it with a heads up, or they are given an intimation that, hey, these are the problems in your environment and so on. Depending on the kind of workflows we have configured or the kind of sequence of recommendation adoption we have configured, we go ahead and then optimize those recommendations while making sure they are not just scoped for the environment and the business units and the workloads, but they are actually ready to be executed at your end, either manually or through auto apply, right? Now, once those changes actually happen, whether you apply it manually or your team, you delegate it to somebody else through the Unravel UI, and then somebody else goes ahead and applies it, right? Or you delegate it to Unravel's autonomous agents, and those agents basically act behind the scene and make those changes. The change point detection algorithms make sure that those recommendations sustain. So let's say any version control system or anybody else reverts the recommendation later on in a few days or in a few weeks, our algorithms basically detect that on an entity that Unravel has been monitoring, there is a drift in the recommendation from what we have actually prescribed. So that end-to-end autonomous governance is something that you get out of the box, and that too, while it fits into your ecosystem, in your CI/CD workflows, in your ticketing and ITSM management, in your configuration version control system, and so on. So this acts less of a, hey, Unravel is giving you all these recommendations, but less of a dashboard and observability, but more as a system of record of how we have looked at your complete cloud spend, identified the inefficiencies, um, applied those inefficiency recommendations with your help or with the autonomous agent's help, and created a complete auditable and role-based access control trail of who acted at what time and what value they have driven. Okay. Now, I think let's switch gears and move on to the demo for a bit. So what you're seeing here is the Unravel UI. I have already logged into the home page, and because it's a multi-platform, let me go ahead and select Databricks. So let's say you come onto the Unravel UI, and we would have already connected to your cloud build data to get the telemetry information about your actual spends across different categories and um, different dimensions of entities, right? So now here we see that there is a spend in a particular month, and there is some potential that Unravel can actually help you save in an annualized value, right? And there is some savings that Unravel has actually already helped you realize. Now let's see how do we navigate the journey from these savings that are available to be used with recommendations to the actual realization of those savings. So I see that there are some opportunities in cost optimization, and then we basically go to the cost optimization FinOps screen here. So when we are actually connected to your bill data, we get the complete end-to-end information around what are the new entities or jobs that have executed in this particular selected month here, right? Or what are the jobs that actually got deprecated or they don't run any longer? So what is the cost reduction because of that? And then whatever jobs that are recurring and being carried forward from the previous months, from those jobs, what is the actual value that you are basically deriving this month, right? And we do this a quarter over quarter analysis and help you identify the top cost drivers or the entities like workspaces or teams or services, business units that are actually contributing to the net cost change for that month in the negative direction, right? And then the top cost reducers are basically the entities that have been running continuously and in this particular month actually have lowered into the cost compared to the previous months. So we look at this data and then we start thinking about, hey, let me explore like what are the business units or the teams that are actually contributing towards this entire spend month over month, right? Now, when I look at this data, I see that there's a particular business unit, a data platform, which shows that there's an overall cost and it is already at risk, right? So I want to look at the overall savings potential and an opportunity here. So looks like despite applying a lot of recommendations that have realized some savings, there are still some savings that we can go ahead and optimize right away. So we go to the optimize actions tab here. And in this view, basically you see all the savings across different categories that are available for that particular business unit across infra, code, and storage. So for this business unit, because we don't have much actions taken across everything, so I'm just resetting the filters. And we will look at, let's say, some recommendations, right? So let's say now in this environment, there are multiple recommendations, like 300 plus recommendations. Now, one option is you keep on looking at every recommendation one by one, right? Who is the owner? What entity is that recommendation on? For what environment? What is the overall cost? And what is the savings potential? And basically, look at the individual recommendation. Okay, this is the Databricks entity and the cost impact, savings impact of this recommendation, if applied, would be about 58% compared to the overall cost, right? Now, you see these couple of recommendations, but then the main actionability kind of comes from Unravel automatically picking up and suggesting an owner for that particular recommendation. Now, assume that this you know that you want to change the owner or you want to assign it to somebody else within your team. So you can change the ownership here. You can basically say that, hey, this is a code recommendation. Let me take a look at it and I'll go ahead and manually apply it, right? So you can change the status and you can even specify the date on which that recommendation was actually manually applied. And let's say you want to reject the recommendation or give additional details, you can provide additional comments or any kind of blockers around it. So you save this, and this information is saved, and what it basically becomes a system of record for Unravel to basically look at this recommendation in the future that, okay, in the recent history, so and so owner from so and so team was actually responsible for looking at this kind of code recommendation, right? And while getting into the details of the recommendations, I think you can go to look at so basically the inefficient that was here, right? And there is a condition uh, that shows, and there's a deviation that shows up on the right side panel that Unravel is suggesting for you to go ahead and change the code. You can give a feedback here on this panel or even have a shortcut to the actions and so on. Or maybe you can just come back and at this point you think that you want to raise a ticket for uh, sending this recommendation details into a integrating with your CI/CD lifecycle, right? Maybe in GitHub or your Azure DevOps. So you connected the proper repo and provide the description, and then link an existing GitHub PR ticket and so on, right? Or you go to ServiceNow, link an existing ticket or create a new ticket from here about the details and uh, who that owner should be and so on. Alternatively, you can send an email alert to the owner directly from this interface, or you can escalate it to the manager of this particular person, right? If the recommendation has been sitting out and not acted upon for a long time. Now, this is a very methodical, step-by-step, actionable way of handling and dealing with a single recommendation. Let's say there are some recommendation categories, like Unravel basically highlights these as auto apply versus manual apply. In most of the cases, unless we are connected to your uh, code repositories and have a deeper integration, we typically bucketize many of the recommendations into the manual category where you have the complete control. But in cases of, let's say, lower environments and blast radius that we will talk about shortly, you might want to go ahead and approve some of the recommendations for auto apply. So you can basically, let's say, enable this recommendation for auto apply, which is then gets queued up, and at a particular time whenever workflow actually runs, that recommendation goes into the queue and then gets applied on this scheduled date and time of the workflow. So this is primarily around, and in this interface, basically you can navigate through, like, who are the users and different states of this recommendation, the entire life cycle broken down into different phases. Let's say in certain cases, we need an input from you, which is missing. Let's say an owner information is missing, or let's say in case of ADF workflows, the resource group is missing, for which you need to give us that information to be for us to be able to qualify that recommendation as eligible for actionability, right? So all of that information sits out in this panel. Now assume that you had created a case or a ticket in ServiceNow or in Jira to track this recommendation end to end, right? So each recommendation, basically, whether you create a ticket or not, is treated as a case in Unravel. And cases is something basically you can come here and look at every entity and how many cases are open against that entity, who's the owner, who needs to act on it, what are the details, is it blocked, is it being acted on, is it in progress, and so on. So the case history lets you get a complete view of what are the open cases, which is in a way of saying that, hey, amongst all these recommendations, somebody has taken some action on those recommendations, whether they have just acknowledged it, they have seen it, they have applied it, they have marked it for auto apply, or they have rejected it, right? So every such action basically lands up as a case in the cases tab here. There's a quicker way for you to actually look at your cases in a calendar view, and even look at the ones that have been already applied or not been actioned on for a week, right? Or some recommendations that have been just sitting out for longer than a week and so on. So this basically helps you get that end-to-end hold into Unravel looked at the complete spend on your Databricks estate. Unravel was able to identify why there was a cost change in a particular month, what drivers basically contributed to that cost change in a positive or a negative manner, looking at those entities and exploring them further and drilling down deeper from them in the optimized workflow. And then looking at basically how many cases are being acted on, not acted on, how many of them are in a critical phase, which cases need attention. And this prioritization is something that can be set through the interface itself based on either cost, savings, performance, reliability, or even cases like, you have a custom threshold and quantification of these cases qualify as important because they are business critical, right? So using tags or your implicit tagging, Unravel can infer a lot of this information right from your business units or your prioritization needs of handling recommendations on different types of entities. Now, I'm showing a very subset view of the entire platform. So this session is not about giving a walkthrough of what Unravel can do and the entire capability, but more into understanding that given a cloud spend, is Unravel the platform that can actually help you look at all the recommendations that it generates and take it through end to end, right? So now imagine that unless somebody comes and actually closes those cases, right? Unravel wouldn't be able to mark that recommendation as complete. But once somebody comes and closes those cases in any way, right, they are resolved or they are basically rejected and so on. So for the cases that basically get closed, Unravel helps you actually see the value end to end. So for example, if you remember in the earlier home screen, we had seen that there was a potential savings available overall, right? And then we drilled into that potential savings for a particular business unit. And then we came to the optimize page. And we saw how we can actually look at the recommendations, look at the depth of the recommendations, uh, assign it to somebody, right? And then come back and create a case and act on the case and so on, and drive the whole auditability of what's happening with your particular entity. Now, the value part is basically that ties this whole story end to end, where the user can come into this timeline view, see how much of the opportunity from the overall target is realized in the particular selected period. And then for each day, let's say on this particular day, I want to see what cases actually contributed to the savings that got realized. How much of the savings got realized per day because of closing those cases. There might be entities with multiple cases getting closed on the same day and so on. So this view basically lets you go and navigate and look at the cases that contributed to the realized savings. And then that information basically gets aggregated, bubbled up at your business unit level. And business units is something that, Unravel works with the customers and make sure that we have all of this mapping done correctly from business unit side, cost center, the ownership attribution, and so on, so that accountability becomes more like an ownership game rather than a who's spending what where kind of a blame attribution game, right? So here, basically, what you are seeing is for all the cases that were closed, all the recommendations that were applied, these are the savings that were resolved, right, by the cases, and these are the savings that are still pending for those business units and all. Now, if you look at the end-to-end journey, it is still tying it back to our insight life cycle here, right? Give me 1 second. I think my Zoom is kind of acting up. Da-da-da-da. Yeah, oops. I think I passed that slide. Yeah. So coming here, right? So we are still in the phase where we are identifying the signals, notifying the owners, using Unravel to optimize your cases, right? And validate that those are actually driving the savings that they were expected to, right? So you have the potential versus realized comparison then and there after the recommendations are applied. Now, when it comes to automation and creating a scalable adoption journey, right? What Unravel does is in the governance tab here, you have something called as workflows. So workflows are our way of, hey, these are the different workflows. Let's say you want to just keep on taking all the right sizing recommendations and keep on sending a weekly alert to the engineering team, right? Or you want to basically take a particular business unit, diagnose all the failures happening for that business unit, and keep on doing a root cause analysis and publish them either on the dashboards or send as an email alert to all the users, right? Now, let's look at this example, right? This is an auto apply example, auto apply at a low risk environment on a dev or a test environment. So we'll look at an existing workflow that was created, but the workflows basically allow you to take all those recommendations and do it at a much larger scale in some way. So for example, now this step here, detecting auto apply candidates, right? So you can basically first, let's look at the scoping part, right? So you can define that, hey, I want to just apply or try out auto apply on a staging environment let's do a dev environment, right? And I want to basically make sure that within dev itself, I want to just try out for two business units, right? Or a specific workspace or a specific owner, right? Or some other custom tags that you may have in place. So those scopes kind of get applied at the start of the workflow that defines the blast radius in a way for the scope of change and auto apply. Then you can define the cadence around, hey, I want this workflow to execute weekly or the last day of the month, send an automated validation report, value realization report, and so on, right? Or I want it to be subject to, let's say, the savings I'm getting out of it. So, as an example, you want to start a auto apply workflow for dev environment, for engineering team, and making sure that it runs every week, right, in a weekly cadence, and make sure that also runs only for recommendations that end up giving me $1,000 per month in savings. So only the high impact ones. So you can define all these knobs and whistles and then come to Unravel, and then Unravel basically pulls up these configurations for every node as you go along and asks you for the missing details here. So that is where you basically define the workflow at a scale, automate it in such a way that once it is running, like once I fill up all the fields and start the workflow, it basically starts in the backend, right? So once it starts running, you will see the progress indicators, like where is it stuck and what nodes is it stuck. Some of the nodes might be in progress. In some cases, the owner information might be missing for more than one clusters and so on, right? So all of that becomes a matter of the actions happening autonomously, but involving you only where it is needed. So the complete a transcript around, like, this line, I'm not sure if you missed this, but a human gated loop, right, for every single recommendation, if it is adding more work into the complete end-to-end process, it sits as yet another Jira ticket waiting to be applied, right? But the moment you are autonomously executing this at scale, uh, deriving the auditability of it, the reliability of the recommendations at scale, making sure that they are actually validated and governed for a larger data set and so on, becomes part of the entire life cycle journey. So I hope this was helpful. And again, this is not like a complete Unravel product walkthrough, but a very specific use case on how we can get from a recommendation to action. Now, before we close out on the piece, one last thing. So, these dashboards that you're seeing currently here, right? In a way, they are also part of our workflows itself, right? We basically, our agents run behind the scenes, continuously monitor your state and populate or identify the signals, fit into the complete user journey on the platform here and so on, right? What you can additionally do is, let's say all of these agents that get created as part of the workflows, you have complete visibility into every agent that is working on that workflow behind the scenes and what kind of problems and issues the agent individually is surfacing. So you will be able to come here, look at the recommendations, the proposed changes on a very timely, on that particular day, what are the top actions that you need to take because the agent has surfaced them and so on. And you can go ahead and ask specific questions as well to the agent from this environment. So coming back, I think that was a really good journey from looking at the dashboard, seeing the spends, and uh, being thorough about, like, the value is actually getting realized at the end, not just something that a recommendation is being handed over to you and you have to now toss it around into your organization, work through the friction and so on until it gets realized. So that was in the past. I think what Unravel actually helps you do is drive that complete actionability end to end with complete accountability on Unravel's end, where we are actually showcasing the potential savings and making every effort by fitting into your organization's workflows to close the loop into realizing those savings. So happy to answer any questions. And thanks again for joining the session today, and look forward to having some other capability driven sessions in the future.